thank you, Brittany and Michael for being part of this session. One of the largest opportunities presented by online research has always been longitudinal data and the ability to collect longitudinal data effectively. And so we have two talks in this session. Brittany Schutz-Reinhardt from the University of Oregon will talk about findings across MTurk on nationally representative samples and political polarization. And then Michael Maniaci is going to talk about collecting intensive longitudinal data. Michael's from Florida Atlantic University. And so, Brittany, over to you.
So I'm going to be talking about some research that we did in 2020, and along with some of my colleagues from the Center of Science Communication at the SOJC and University of Oregon. And what we did is we started with a longitudinal data set that we collected using CloudResearch. And we also wanted to see how well the results replicated to a larger nationally representative sample. And so our data set is about 1,300 US workers that we recruited from MTurk. And we retained about 62 to 77% of them across 4 additional waves of data collection. What we've tended to do with CloudResearch, we actually just launched recently our 5th longitudinal panel recently. We tend to collect baseline data for between 1,000 and 1,500 participants. And then we'll follow up with them for additional like correlational studies or experimental studies, anything where we don't think that one experiment is going to influence another experiment. And what we've typically found is that, sometimes even 10 months later, we can still get about 80% of our sample with CloudResearch. We also occasionally in our lab use the Understanding America study, which is managed by the University of Southern California Dornschleife. It's a large nationally representative sample. They have about 13,000 participants who have completed some comprehensive data that includes demographics and some cognitive ability variables. It's all free to the public. So as a researcher, you can go log in, get an account with Understanding America Study, and as long as things aren't being embargoed, you're free to download their data and use it as you wish. And so what we did is we used what they call their comprehensive file, along with, they collected a sample of longitudinal COVID reactions last year. And they get about a 72 to 97% response rate across those surveys. And they also about once a year measure, measure political ideology and voting behaviors. And so from that 9,500 participants, we really only get 4,500 that are usable because so few participants completed the end of the year survey where they're actually giving us the political ideology that we needed in order to look for political polarization. And so what we recommend, what we found that works the best for our longitudinal surveys is we do things a little bit differently, and we select people that have done a lot more surveys than I think we would do for our one-off surveys. So we actually limit to MTurkers with at least 5,000 hits and 99% survey completion. And we do that because we want these to be people that have been using MTurk for a while, and the ones that have been using it for a while are likely to continue. And we also explicitly mention follow-up surveys in our recruitment. We also use, so Labe earlier today talked about, they have, what did you say, Labe? I think 100,000 of the MTurkers you guys have screened. And so the default is the participants that have been blocked that, consistently provide bad data are not included. So we do use that setting. We also use suspicious geolocations and geolocations outside the United States. We've also found, so the suspicious geolocations and geolocations outside the United States, I think that was in response to the summer of bots in 2018. But we actually found that the selection practices that we had in place, even back in 2018, we only ended up needing to eliminate 8 participants from one of these longitudinal panels by using 5,000 hits, survey completion, and really similar to the recommendations that you guys may have heard earlier today, depending on which session you were in. We code open-ended responses for nonsense. We include really unobtrusive checks. So these could be really easy questions at the beginning of a ability measure, which participants are super used to. You start with something easy and it gets harder. So it's not something that they find is like tricky or kind of deceptive. We also might ask them practice questions. So we sometimes use sliders and we say, here for this next thing, you're actually going to have to slide this. So why don't you slide it to 50%? And then at the end, we also ask them if they look up answers and we pay them if they do, and then we exclude their data. And this last item is usually where we get our most exclusions. We get pretty good data quality. The other reason that we really like using CloudResearch instead of, we could have just gone with this Understanding America study, but using CloudResearch as opposed to other panels, with CloudResearch and MTurk, we were really in control of when we were deciding to field studies and put them into the field and pull them out of the field. So as far as I know, we have one of the earliest COVID-related data sets. We were in the field in mid-February of 2020, right after the first reported death. Just excuse me. Then we pulled out of the field quickly because there was the first US case and we were concerned that our baseline was going to have this very big historic event that was going to, cause one part of our baseline to be different than the rest of the baseline. We went back into the field in early March, then late March, we went back into the field around the time everything was shutting down. We checked in with our participants again in May and then in the summer. And then we waited about 6 months and followed up with them again in December. So the sample that we recruited was more liberal, more white, and more highly educated than the general population, as others have found. Our recruitment efforts were pretty successful. We only needed to exclude 4% of our baseline data, and that's pretty typical for what we find in our longitudinal panels. And then after that initial exclusion, we really only excluded less than 1% of each successive wave. Retention was higher for older, more educated participants. And in our later waves, we had heard lots of other people were in the field with COVID surveys. So we did some exploratory analyses to see, do we have anything systematic with respect to our longitudinal participants? Is completing more of our surveys doing something? Is completing other surveys in the past week doing something? And what we basically found was they were really weak effects and they went in opposite directions. So completing other COVID-related surveys outside of our lab was associated with higher negative emotional responses to COVID, but completing more of our surveys over time was associated with lower emotional responses. So we don't really see anything systematic like a pattern of responses. But this is one of our recommendations for people that are studying things that end up being really popular topics, is we can include this, how many other surveys have you taken in the past week, as a control variable if reviewers request it. Um, the study objectives that we had were to look at political polarization and to see whether people higher in cognitive ability were more likely to show polarization. So a lot of times people that are higher in cognitive ability make better decisions, so they're less biased. But in certain situations, so climate change beliefs are a good example of this. There's been a number of studies that have shown either education or numeracy relates to greater polarization and perceived risk of things like human-caused climate change. So what we wanted to do with this project is show ability-related polarization longitudinally in a novel topic, which was COVID, and then explore which type of cognitive ability. So we thought numeric ability might matter more because so much of the information about COVID was numeric, but also verbal ability might matter because we know knowledge is something that predicts greater political knowledge is associated with greater polarization in terms of having, greater coherence between ideology and political attitudes. We chose to use the UAS data to confirm the results in an independent representative sample. Because we started in February, what we actually thought was going to happen with respect to polarization is that the Republicans or the more conservatives would be showing more fear of COVID because it was this threat coming from outside, from China, to threaten the United States. And of course, what we've ended up finding is very, very different. So we also have a bunch of similar measures across these different data sets. Both data sets have measures of objective numeracy and verbal analogies. So objective numeracy is measured mainly with questions that have to do with probability. So imagine we roll a fair six-sided die 1,000 times. Out of 1,000 rolls, how many times do you think the die would come up as an even number? We also used verbal analogies. This is one of the ones from the UAS data. It's one of the easy ones. Mother is to daughter as father is to son. Sorry. And then the UAS data also included 2 additional measures of cognitive ability. The number series task, which asks people to figure out what number goes next in a series, and picture a vocabulary from the Woodcock-Johnson. So this one is another example of an easy kind of example that comes before the actual measures. Ideology was either self-reported liberalism, conservatism. We measured it that way in UO epidemic. And then UAS didn't have a measure of liberalism, conservatism in the most recent end of the year survey. So we just did Democrat, Republican Party alignment. They have a number of questions that ask people how strongly identified they are with the two parties, whether they're strongly aligned, just identified, or only slightly lean Democrat or Republican. We also looked at risk perceptions in slightly different ways. So in our study, we used 6 items across each wave. Things like how likely is it that you will get coronavirus at some time in the future? And overall, how much risk do you think that the coronavirus poses to health, safety, and prosperity in the United States? And this last question is based on Dan Kahan's work. He's done a lot of the work that has shown effects of motivated numeracy and climate change risk, for example. UAS used 0 to 100 sliders. What's the chance you'll get coronavirus in the next 3 months? And what's, if you do get the coronavirus, what's the % chance you'll die from it? And so we find remarkably similar effects across the 2 data sets. So I'm going to show you I'm going to focus on the UO epidemic first because it's easier to understand because we don't actually have effects of wave with respect to this polarization. And so at lower verbal analogy scores versus higher verbal analogy scores, the difference between conservatives and liberals is larger for the high ability and smaller for the low ability. You can also see a similar pattern in the later waves of the UAS data, but not in the initial wave. So here, the dotted lines are the lower ability and the solid lines are the higher ability. Their waves began in early March and were basically every 2 weeks after that. And I think that they are actually still in the field. But you can see very similar findings that there is a moderation by wave, that the ability related polarization really emerges in wave 2 and gets kind of stabilizes over time, but remains steady. We also looked at, in the UO epidemic data, some additional potential mechanisms through which ability related polarization could occur. And we were originally thinking that numeracy would matter more than other ability variables, because so much of the information about COVID was numeric. But what we consistently found is when we saw ability related polarization, it was always verbal ability that was associated with greater polarization, and it was less likely to be the case that numeric ability was associated with greater polarization. In particular, with risk perceptions, what we saw instead is that people that have higher numeric ability simply had lower risk perceptions. And it really seems to be the verbal ability that matters. Verbal ability also predicted greater bias. I don't know if bias is the right word, greater selective exposure, let's say, to liberal versus conservative media, such that people that were higher in ability were more likely to consume media that was consistent with their ideology. We also gave them information that could be interpreted multiple ways. And people higher in ability tended to interpret information in ways consistent with their ideology when they were higher in verbal ability. So for example, we asked them, here's kind of a graph of the trajectory of cases. If you're right here and the current risk is low, what does that say about future risk? And people that are liberal kind of say, well, that just means we're at the beginning of the curve and it could go up. Whereas people that are conservative are more likely to say, if the risk is low now, it will continue to be low. And that tendency for liberals and conservatives to have different interpretations of the same data was stronger for people higher in verbal ability. In the UAS data, we also looked at a couple cross-sectional political attitudes. One had to do with Medicare for all, the second had to do with the weapons buyback, and we found the same thing where ideology predicted responses to these policy attitudes more among people that were high in ability than low in ability. So what we found is that retention and quality of MTRIC data collected on CloudResearch was great. And we had really great retention, even 10 months later. We found ability related polarization in longitudinal data collected from CloudResearch and in secondary analysis of Understanding America study. Results are very similar, even though, MTRIC data skews liberal. So we had to make a few little adjustments in the way we were analyzing things to deal with the fact that we had more liberals and conservatives in particular were underrepresented. But the thing that I think is really interesting is that, CloudResearch is very cost effective. So and more time sensitive. So I did some quick calculations and we only spent about 25 cents a minute per participant on CloudResearch. And this included retention bonuses. UAS, you can actually add questions to their panel, but they charge $2 per minute per participant. And so typically you're looking at 7,000 participants. So you're looking at $14,000 to ask 1 minute of questions one time. So when you take that into account, CloudResearch is very cost effective, not to mention that we were able to go in and out of the field in response to these events that would have been changing our participants' responses within one wave of data collection. Although, UAS is very generous and lets people download their data when it's past embargo. You don't have the control because you're just analyzing it secondarily. And so if if you're interested in more, the results that I covered are available in a paper that just came out in Intelligence, and you can actually download it for free until October 9th. We have a site archive paper that has more detailed information about our methods. If you'd like to check out Understanding America Study, I have a link to that. And then we've also covered our COVID research on our website. And now I think we can do questions. Or no questions.
Just say I enjoy the talk, and I was trying to frantically take pictures of your links before your slides disappeared. If you'd be kind enough to share those in the chat, you'll have many fans in the ether out here. So
there's a link, I think, where I uploaded the slides. Labe, do you know how to tell people to get to those?
Yes, I know that if you want to know how to do it, you should ask Rachel.
Okay, I'm gonna try. So it looks like while Michael is getting ready, I'll try to figure out how. I think I have Microsoft OneDrive, and I can put a link to the slides in there. Thank you.
Yeah, and all the talks are recorded, so everything's going to be up very short. Everything's going to be available very shortly on the conference website, so you can access all the talks from today for the next, I think, 3 months on the conference website, and then thereafter we'll have a separate page on CloudResearch where you'll always be able to access.
Yep. Part of the challenge is always when you have these short links, is it an L, is it a 1, is it an I, and figuring all that out when you're just staring at a video screen.
Yeah. I'll copy and paste that entire last slide with all the links here in a second.
Hey, I just had a quick question for you. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. I'm on mobile, so I'm trying to navigate Zoom on a tiny screen here. So did you guys control for whether or not they were actively engaging in COVID prevention types of things? Were they wearing masks and stuff like that?
We didn't, and the reason for that is because it's both constrained by what state they lived in, where there were different requirements by state, and also we know from other data that it is so dependent on political ideology. So it would be really tricky to control for that. The UAS data would be better served for that because they were asking nearly every other week what people had done the previous week, whereas we were in the field at differing intervals.
Should I go ahead and?
Yeah, I think this is right about the perfect time. So yeah, thank you, Michael. If you can start whenever you're ready.
I'm Michael Maniaci, and I'm an associate professor at Florida Atlantic University. Angeli Wilson is a graduate student that works in my lab, and she helped collect a lot of the data some of the data I'm going to talk about with an intensive longitudinal project focusing on daily social experiences and loneliness. So I'll discuss that project as an example, but more broadly, I want to talk about intensive longitudinal data and how we can use crowdsourcing services to collect intensive longitudinal data confidentially or potentially even with some degree of anonymity. So I'm keying this talk for different audiences. I assume some of you have used crowdsourcing services or panel services to collect maybe traditional longitudinal data or cross-sectional data. So I want to explain why you might consider adding intensive longitudinal methods to your research repertoire. And what do I mean by an intensive longitudinal method? And I assume maybe some of you have collected intensive longitudinal data in more traditional sources with maybe an undergraduate participant pool or a community sample. So I want to talk about some of the unique benefits and challenges of collecting intensive longitudinal data through crowdsourcing apps specifically. So first I want to talk about longitudinal designs in general. As researchers, we're often interested in understanding change in some way. Even in a cross-sectional laboratory experiment, we might be interested in how participants change in response to some environmental manipulation, let's say. But if we really want to understand within-person processes and within-person change, that requires longitudinal data. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One is that a lot of processes that we're interested in the behavioral sciences are non-ergodic, meaning that the patterns that we can observe at the between-person level, when we're comparing across different groups of participants, maybe with something measured cross-sectionally, can differ from the patterns of change that we observe at the within-person level. Sometimes those patterns look similar, but often they don't, and they might represent different aspects of that process. We can also examine within-person processes over different time scales. So what I would consider a more traditional longitudinal design would include a relatively small number of longitudinal assessments collected over sort of more broadly spaced time periods on the scale of years, months, but we can also look at within-person change at more densely packed time scale. So we could select a specific month and look across weeks or, excuse me, or days, or we could just sample people's experiences within a week or within a day and look at patterns of change over hours and minutes. Now, sometimes the processes that we could observe at these different time scales might look similar, but there's no reason that we should assume that they would be. Okay, so on the one hand, it's often important, if we want to understand within-person processes of change, to collect longitudinal data. But sometimes if we're interested in processes that unfold at sort of shorter time scales, we might need to collect more intensive longitudinal data. So a very simple example that just conceptually highlights the distinction between person and within-person processes is loneliness and sleep quality. There is research looking at chronic individual differences in loneliness, which we might measure using a self-report scale that asks questions like, how frequently do you feel connected to other people? How often do you feel isolated from others? So we could measure chronic individual differences in loneliness among a sample of participants, and also measure their sleep quality, maybe using a self-report measure or a laboratory sleep study. And based on previous research, I'd expect to find that at the between-person level, people who report generally feeling lonelier might report lower sleep quality. But we could also examine this process at the within-person level. So if we collect maybe intensive longitudinal measures at the level of days, let's say, we might look at participants, ask participants to fill out a survey at the end of every day and ask, how lonely did you feel today? To what extent did you feel like there was someone you could talk to? To what extent did you feel isolated from others today? And then the following morning, we could ask about sleep quality with a self-report scale, or maybe we can get some physiological data. If we aggregate across those repeated measures assessments, I'd expect to find the same between-person pattern, that participants who generally feel lonelier across, let's say, a week or 2 weeks, I would expect them to generally report poorer quality sleep. But would we also find the same pattern at the within-person level? We have some unpublished data. I won't go into the details, and obviously these illustrations are far too neat looking for actual data. But we find that independent of the between-person effect, we also find a comparable effect at the within-person level. That on days when people report feeling lonelier than their own average, the next morning they report experiencing poorer quality sleep than they typically do. So in this case, the processes look similar, but there's no reason that necessarily has to be the case. In fact, there's some examples in the literature looking at momentary emotional experiences. And let's say that we beep participants and ask them to fill out a survey at particular moments throughout the day using maybe something called experience sampling methodology. And we ask them, at this moment, how angry do you feel? And at this moment, how sad do you feel? If we aggregate at the between person level, we might find that people who generally report feeling angrier also generally report feeling sadder, but they're not necessarily experiencing high levels of anger and sadness in the same moment. These are very different emotional experiences. So it's sort of difficult to feel very angry and very sad in the exact same moment. So again, this is an example where we can have different patterns potentially at the between person and within person level of analysis. And the time scale we focus on might give us a very different picture. If I measure momentary anger and sadness, or if I ask you at the end of the day, how angry did you feel today? How sad did you feel today? Or if I look at a time scale of weeks or months or years, we might get very different patterns. So in a sense, intensive longitudinal methods really aren't so different than other sorts of longitudinal methods. But I want to clarify what I mean by intensive. And this is an image of a book that I highly recommend if you're actually working with intensive longitudinal data by Niall Bolger and J.P. Lawrenceau, that gets a little bit more into some of the some of the complex statistical and data analytic considerations. But on page 1 of this book, they say that intensive longitudinal methods involve sequences of repeated measurements sufficiently frequent to allow one to characterize a separate change process for each subject. And more specifically, this is just an umbrella term that really refers to a wide variety of methods that go by many different names: experience sampling, ecological momentary assessment, daily diary designs, and so on, that typically have at least 5, but typically many more longitudinal measurements. Maybe we ask participants to fill out surveys, excuse me, 7 times a day at random intervals across a period of days, or every day for a period of 2 weeks or 3 or 4 weeks. These methods typically, not always, but typically examine everyday experiences and behavior in more ecologically valid contexts outside of the laboratory. So these methods don't replace controlled laboratory experimentation, but they supplement it by looking at more ecologically valid contexts. So we can examine how some process unfolds in someone's day-to-day life and look at how it might vary as a function of context that they might experience across their day-to-day life. These methods are often, again, not always, but often designed to clearly differentiate within person and between person processes, often to sort of clearly narrow in on those within person effects, or to look at how within person and between person effects can interact. So for instance, in the context of loneliness, maybe someone who is chronically lonely might respond differently to a transient shift in their loneliness. So we can look at these cross-level interactions. This figure shows the number of publications each year in PsycNet, which includes thousands of journals and books and so on, using a few different terms that represent different types of intensive longitudinal designs: experience sampling, ecological momentary assessment, and so on. And many of these terms date back to the 1970s, and these methods have been used for decades. But over the last decade, we've seen an explosion of growth. I mean, exponential growth in the use of these types of methods across various areas of the behavioral sciences. And there are a few reasons for this. One is due to technology. So we have a lot more tools at our disposal for facilitating the collection of this type of intensive longitudinal data. It used to be the case that in early studies, participants would just receive a packet of paper and pencil questionnaires. This is an example of the Rochester interaction record, where participants, usually undergraduate students, would have a packet of these paper and pencil questionnaires, And they'd go about their day, and every time they experienced an interaction lasting at least 10 minutes, they'd be asked to pull out one of these forms and answer a few questions about it. And then every few days, drop off the forms in the laboratory. Eventually, researchers started using digital signals, so still paper and pencil, but controlling when participants are signaled to fill out the survey. Researchers use digital stamps to try to verify when participants were doing it. But I think we've seen much greater utilization of these methods as technology has allowed researchers to program personal digital assistants and give them to participants where they could be signaled in a specific way, but also respond directly on the device. And now most of us have smartphones. And so it's much easier to do these kind of methods by having participants install an app on their phone or sending them a text message that links to a survey. So methodology, and also there have been advances in the quantitative methods that have facilitated this type of research. But I think a lot of this exponential growth deals with the unique benefits of intensive longitudinal methods. So why collect intensive longitudinal data? I mentioned a few benefits. For one, we can enhance ecological validity, and this often works very well in conjunction with traditional methods. So we might use laboratory experiments to get some more carefully controlled causal effects, but then we can follow up with a more ecologically valid study that looks at how the process unfolds in someone's day-to-day life. We can better distinguish within person and between person processes and look at different sort of time scales. We can examine predictors of within person change. So if we have enough within person data, we can use methods that allow us to estimate a within person association, or maybe a within person trajectory of change for each participant, and look at the degree to which participants differ in their patterns of change. So we can look at heterogeneity in those within person processes, and then maybe try to predict that heterogeneity. What accounts for these different trajectories that participants experience. Another benefit is, even if you're not interested in within person change, we can dramatically reduce retrospective recall bias. So rather than asking participants to think back about their how often do you typically feel isolated from other people, if I can send you a survey and say, right now, how isolated do you feel? Or something about your momentary social experiences, let's say. Even if I just aggregate across all those reports, this can still be a dramatic benefit. So why doesn't everyone use these methods? Well, they present unique challenges. Participant burden tends to be dramatically higher than other sorts of designs, even other sorts of longitudinal methods, where it can be difficult to ensure that participants stay in the longitudinal study. If you're asking participants to fill out multiple surveys a day, or to fill out surveys every day over a period of weeks at specific times, it's a larger participant burden. And so compliance can be more complicated. You might usually need to communicate directly with participants to ensure that they stay in the study, remind them to do the studies, follow up with them if they miss a few studies. And in the context of using crowdsourcing services, I think this is a unique benefit because we can communicate with participants in some cases without requiring them to give us personally identifiable information, which might be beneficial in some contexts. There are also data analytic complications related to non-independence, missing data, autoregressive effects. So again, the Bolger and Lorenzo intensive longitudinal methods book goes into some of those more data analytic considerations. I'm not going to talk about that today. So here's the same figure showing explosive growth in various terms related to intensive longitudinal designs with this red line. And also I added here a blue dash line showing the explosive growth in publications that have mentioned either crowdsourcing or Mechanical Turk or MTurk. And this isn't meant to be comprehensive. I know there are many other crowdsourcing services and panel services besides Mechanical Turk. But I just want to illustrate the explosive growth in these two, let's say, methodologies. So what about their conjunctive use? How many publications have referenced both these specific terms related to intensive longitudinal designs, and also one of these terms related to crowdsourcing, Mechanical Turk, and so on. Well, this isn't meant to be comprehensive. I'm sure I missed many relevant studies, but just based on these terms, between 1990 and 2020, I found 17 articles. So I'm not sure if you can see this little inchworm of a line down here. So despite the exponential growth in use of intensive longitudinal designs and use of crowdsourcing services, they haven't been used in combination. So when Angela Wilson and I set out to collect some intensive longitudinal data over the summer, we had some trouble finding resources that would guide us in terms of what can we expect in terms of compliance, what should we use for incentives, how should we set this up. There's some fantastic resources on longitudinal data through Mechanical Turk and CloudResearch and other sources, but intensive longitudinal methods present unique challenges that we had to spend some time kind of guesstimating and thinking through, and that's why I wanted to give this talk. So why should we use crowdsourcing to collect intensive longitudinal data? Same reasons that everyone else has been talking about today. Crowdsourcing services and other panel services allow us to efficiently recruit large, relatively diverse samples. And when I say relatively, well, in comparison to typical convenience samples, but also there are tools available through CloudResearch, for instance, that can allow you to approach a representative sample if you use pre-screening and so on. So this might be potentially more cost-effective than community samples, and also afford greater confidentiality, potentially some degree of anonymity. I'm going to come back to how we tried to address that. So I'm going to skip over some of the details of this study because I just want to focus on the methods. But over the summer, we collected data from, we pre-registered that we wanted data from 200 participants, and we used a daily diary design where we asked them questions about their daily social experiences, loneliness, well-being, and other things every evening for just 1 week. So this is sort of the bare minimum of what I might consider an intensive longitudinal design. And we pre-registered that we wanted at least 200 participants who filled out at least 4 daily surveys, among other things. We had an initial survey with demographics, some dispositional measures, and so on, and then a daily survey that began the following evening, where for 7 evenings, we sent out a survey invitation at 7 p.m. local time. So we recruited participants across time zones in the US. We asked about their time zone, and we programmed the invitation to go out at 7 p.m. And we asked them to complete it, ideally by 10 a.m., but we accepted surveys up until noon the next day. We recruited participants across different days and times. We tried to make sure we weren't just getting East Coast participants. In some cases, we used in CloudResearch micro batching so that the survey was available over different portions of the day. And we were also interested in getting data from younger and older adults. So what we did was set up separate surveys and restricted one survey to people who were younger than 50 and a different survey for people 50 plus. And we did that over several waves of data collection. We also used several data quality features in CloudResearch. We used CloudResearch approved participants. We blocked suspicious GeoIP addresses. We required a 90% or more hit approval in Mechanical Turk. So I want to be clear about this. If you don't use the same features, I can't guarantee that you'd have similar results in terms of compliance and data quality. And we also wanted to maintain some degree of anonymity. So this is what I think was really novel about the approach of using CloudResearch. So we used CloudResearch as sort of an intermediary between us and Mechanical Turk so that we weren't directly recording any identifiable information about participants. Now, some studies that have collected longitudinal data through Mechanical Turk will ask participants to volunteer their email addresses. Technically, Mechanical Turk says you shouldn't do that. I think maybe the loophole is if you don't require it for that hit. People have done it. But what we did is advertise the study as a study that involves multiple components. We were very clear about that. And we recorded anonymized worker IDs through CloudResearch. And then we used CloudResearch to contact participants using those anonymized worker IDs and email them links to the follow-up survey so that we could communicate with participants, track compliance without ever recording the Mechanical Turk worker ID directly, which could be identifiable in some cases, and without asking any individually identifiable information about participants. Now, I say some degree of anonymity because Qualtrics and other survey programs often save IP addresses by default, so you need to be careful about what you're actually recording. And we had participants identify themselves, so we sent these links that that included an anonymized worker ID, but if participants respond through the Mechanical Turk interface, that includes their email address and name and so on. So participants can identify themselves, but this is dramatically greater anonymity than what's typical in these kind of intensive longitudinal designs. So in terms of compliance, we recruited 246 participants. We excluded 2 based on pre-registered criteria due to fast responding, completing the initial survey less than 1 second per question. Out of the 244 eligible, 213 did the initial diary survey, and 200 of those provided usable data, which we considered at least 4 out of the 7 daily surveys on time, by noon local time. And the majority of those participants did all surveys. There were just a few that did 4 or 5. So on average, we had 6.57 daily surveys submitted on time from these 200 participants. So our sample size is 1,314 daily observations nested within 200 participants. So one thing I want to emphasize is that with an intensive longitudinal design, you're placing much higher burden on participants. And so you need to incentivize them appropriately. So for one thing, we tried to keep our surveys very short. They were both around 50 items or less for the initial survey and the daily surveys. And we incentivized based in a way that encouraged participants to meet certain criteria. So if they just completed the initial survey, the median time was just 3 minutes. We paid 50 cents. If they started the next daily survey the following evening, they got an additional $1. So now they're earning more than minimum wage. If they provided usable data, we gave them a $5 bonus. And if they did all 7 surveys, we paid them an additional $5 bonus. So the maximum payment was $11.50, but we sort of scaled it in a way to encourage compliance. And for participants who did every survey, the median amount of time they spent across all these surveys was 28 minutes, which corresponded to about $24 an hour, $24.64 per hour. We probably could have paid a little bit less, but we wanted to maximize our compliance, because the thing is, if you pay less and have poor compliance, then you have to worry about if participants who dropped out or who skipped surveys on the weekend differ from participants who continued in the survey. So overall, we paid about $13.44 per participant on average. In terms of demographic diversity, what I have here are some figures from the US Census, our current study, and another study using somewhat similar methods from an undergraduate participant pool collected about a decade ago with different methods, but also an experience sampling study. And our median age, our gender proportion of married participants, distribution of participants across time zones in the United States was not so far off from census figures, at least much better than our undergraduate participant pool sample, which is a very restricted age range, overwhelmingly female, very few married participants, everyone in a particular time zone. Now we could have selected participants in a way that ensured a representative sample in other ways. We didn't do that, so we ended up with a very white, we overrepresented white participants, underrepresented Black and African American participants, Hispanic, Latino or Latina participants. But we could have stratified sampling in a way to get a more representative sample in these ways as well. So here I have, again, in this column, I have some information about our current study. And over here, I have information from our undergraduate participant pool study. In terms of compliance, in the current study, 94% of surveys were submitted on time, even before excluding participants who just did 1 survey or 2 surveys. Still, we had 90% compliance. In our undergraduate participant survey, we had an evening and a morning survey over 2 weeks. So we had 89% of evening surveys, 82% of morning surveys. Now it's kind of apples to oranges because we had a narrower time band in that study. We had a morning and an evening survey. It was over a longer period of time. But I think compliance rate, I expected poorer compliance with this study. I expected it to be under 80%. So I was happy with this. We had some data check, some data quality measures in the initial survey. In our MTurk sample, no one missed our 2 directed questions. 2 participants we excluded for answering impossibly quickly. We didn't have similar measures in our undergraduate sample. We also had some impossibly fast responses in our diary surveys, but it was less than 1%. And there were no participants who responded faster than 1 second per question across all of the daily surveys. It was usually, there were maybe a few surveys for some participants that they completed very quickly, but we actually retained those in our analyses. In terms of internal consistency reliability, this is a trait measure. But what's more relevant in terms of intensive longitudinal designs is reliability of within-person change. So measures that work well at the between-person level aren't necessarily going to work as well in terms of being sensitive to within-person change over a period of days. So I won't go into the details here. I could share references if this is relevant to you. But this is a measure of reliability for detecting within-person change for, in this case, daily loneliness. And in our undergraduate sample, we had a 4-item measure of loneliness. In the MTurk sample, we included more items. But if you compare just the same 4 items, they're pretty close in terms of their within-person reliability. And the 12-item measure had much better reliability. So this is an important message because with intensive longitudinal designs, you're often asking a lot more of participants. And so you often need to be much more selective in terms of, it's very common to use 1-item measures, 2-item measures, 3-item measures, but you often need to strike a balance between not overwhelming participants so that they'll drop out of the study or so you'll have more missing data, but also having enough items that you'll be able to reliably measure those within-person fluctuations, and also selecting items that are sensitive to change. So at the between-person level, you might ask a question like, I'm an extroverted person. At the within-person level, you could ask, today I was an extroverted person, but that might not be as sensitive to day-to-day fluctuations as other types of items. Like today I felt connected to other people. I'm going to skip over this because I want to save time for questions and so on. But I'll just quickly mention that in terms of data quality, our confirmatory, we had some pre-registered confirmatory hypotheses tests that Anjali Wilson used for her master's thesis. And these effects were supported, clearly supported in these data and in a way that's consistent with our predictions and theory and past research. So for instance, daily loneliness was higher on days characterized by less time spent interacting with others and by poor quality social interaction relative to one's own average. And those effects were moderated by chronic loneliness. So for people who are generally lonelier, they experienced there was a stronger association between time spent interacting with others and daily loneliness. And we were able to observe this with just no more than 7 repeated measures assessment. So I think this speaks to the sort of quality of the data. We also found various day of the week versus weekend effects that are consistent with previous research in terms of positive and negative emotions, loneliness, patterns of social interaction, how much time people spend interacting, the quality of those interactions, and so on. So again, I think that's also evidence consistent with we can replicate within-person patterns that were collected usually with more repeated measures assessments, but often with samples that are much less diverse in many ways, especially in terms of age. So many previous studies rely on adolescents or undergraduate participants. In this study, our median age was close to 50. So a couple best practice considerations for using crowdsourcing to collect longitudinal data. First, select an appropriate timescale and protocol that fits your theory of change. In some contexts, daily data or within-day data might not be relevant. Maybe a more traditional longitudinal design is more appropriate. So there are different protocols. An event contingent protocol is one where participants are asked to complete a survey after every event matching a particular criteria. A signal contingent protocol is one where participants complete a survey after being signaled. So these two methods are might be a little harder to implement through crowdsourcing. So you'd have to rely on participants to follow up with the survey if they experience a particular event. It might be a little difficult to signal participants in a way that they could complete a survey in a particular moment. But I think interval contingent protocols are a good fit. So this is where participants know that they'll be expected to complete a survey at a predetermined interval. In our case, it was every day over a period of a week. So participants know when the survey will be available, when they're expected to do it, how that would influence the incentive that they receive. So this approach, this type of protocol minimizes participant burden. It's maybe a little more susceptible to retrospective recall biases. So you're still asking people to retrospectively recall what happened that day in a way that, in some contexts, it might be better to get the signal contingent, being able to program a survey in a smartphone and have participants answer brief questions throughout the day on their device, for instance. Another best practice is to carefully select measures, and often you need to adapt measures. And this is a big limitation in various types of intensive longitudinal methods, because a lot of the survey development literature and literature focused on validating measures focuses on the between-person level. But measures that work well at the between-person level aren't necessarily going to work as well at the within-person level. And also, due to the participant burden, it's very common to rely on single item measures or very short measures. So you often have to balance these considerations. Usually you need to choose shorter measures or measure fewer constructs to minimize burden, enhance compliance. But ideally, if possible, you'll select a measure that's been validated in a similar study, or at least try to select items that are going to be sensitive to within-person change. It's also essential to appropriately incentivize compliance. You need to incentivize people more than even a traditional longitudinal study, because you're not asking people to follow up on a study that they get the link and they can do it anytime in a 2-week period. You're asking them every day of the week to do a survey within a particular time frame in a way that you don't want missing data to be confounded by if someone's working a night shift or week versus weekend. So you need to clearly communicate expectations to participants and follow up with them to ensure compliance, but also appropriately incentivize compliance. So I'll leave it there, and I think I went over my 20-minute mark, but I think if there are questions for either the two speakers, let me know.
Does anyone have any questions? I'll just reflect on one thing that I noticed, which is just that very interesting graph that you shared with just this proliferation of studies, right, over the last, I guess, what was it, like 10 years? Yeah, the intensive longitudinal studies over the last 10 years, and then also the proliferation of the use of crowdsourcing platforms, and then just the combination of the two is like flat. Like it's not, it's all the way at the bottom, and it's like it doesn't seem to be increasing. And I find that really surprising. Is that because, I mean, as you just presented, it was such a compelling presentation of how relatively easy it is. I mean, I say easy, nothing is easy, but like compared to like doing this 20 years ago,
right?
Or just in the lab. So why do you think online platforms haven't been utilized more for this kind of intensive research, longitudinal research?
Well, I think for one thing, this is just based on these specific terms in PsycNet, and There are other studies that are relevant that just didn't use these key terms. And I think I actually think in terms of this sort of dip here over the last few years, I think that's probably due to people just, Mechanical Turk and crowdsourcing is less novel. So I think people maybe don't always highlight it in abstracts and so on in the same way. And there are also a lot of other panels and other sorts of services that people are using. I think part of this is probably because these types of methods are difficult to do well, I think, and it took me and Angelique spent a lot of time trying to look for other resources and just estimate, okay, how many participants do we think, if we pay 50 cents or 25 cents for the initial survey and this amount for the next survey, how many people are going to actually convert into the daily surveys? I was actually estimating it would only be about 50%. There's another study using different methods that had sort of a 50% follow through. And there aren't a lot of guides out there. There are guides on longitudinal methods, and the CloudResearch site has some really helpful guidelines. But intensive longitudinal methods, I think, present sort of unique challenges. So researchers who are utilizing these methods are often doing it with more traditional, student samples or community samples. And in some cases, that might be because they want to bring them into the laboratory, maybe give them a pre-programmed cell phone that can also get maybe location data, or maybe can combine with sensors to get physiological data or ambulatory data. So I don't think that CloudResearch is the right solution for every type of intensive longitudinal study, especially if you are trying to signal participants at multiple times throughout the day. I think that's a lot harder to do with this type of an online panel, let's say. It's been done, but I think that's one of the reasons that with some protocols, participants or researchers might rely more on student samples or community samples, where maybe they can bring them into the lab and train them with working through the survey, and pay them a higher amount to continue complying. But I think that this sort of conjunction will become more common. And the main use case that I see is, I think it's a fantastic benefit that you have the opportunity to collect this type of intensive longitudinal data while better protecting participant confidentiality. Maybe not guaranteeing anonymity, but I think that's pretty novel, because usually you often bring participants into the laboratory or have them install an app on their cell phone, or at the very least get their email address, phone number. I've done studies like this in the past where we call participants. If they miss 2 surveys in a row, we call them, we email them, we follow up with them to try to guarantee compliance. And I also think, honestly, I expected poorer compliance from this study. So I'm not sure to what extent that's due to using some of these data quality. We did use the CloudResearch approved participants and so on. I think it'll probably become more common over time.
Yeah, and I think probably paying well, definitely, we know from some of the research that we've looked at, makes a really big difference. I think your pay structure definitely went a long way. Let's see, I think there's a question in the chat.
Do you think your high compliance was due to a large number of daily users? I'm not sure. What do you mean by daily? Oh, as in the number of Mechanical Turk participants who, and yeah. So the way I actually didn't really clarify this, but we actually didn't follow the research on the CloudResearch website in terms of we didn't follow their suggestions for setting up longitudinal studies. So one way to do it is to set up a separate hit for each survey and set it up so that participants who begin the survey, that you have to be enrolled in the survey to qualify for the day 2 survey, the day 3 survey, the day 4 survey, and so on. And so that would require participants to log into the Mechanical Turk website, and we might still need to email them so they know the survey is available. The way we set it up was we collected their anonymized worker IDs through CloudResearch, and then we used the mTurk interface. Actually, we also did this through CloudResearch, but we could have done it directly through Mechanical Turk to message participants with a link to the daily survey, where we program that email to go out at a specific time every day, so 7 p.m. local time. And that included a link to the survey that included that anonymized worker ID, so they didn't have to log in to Mechanical Turk to do the follow-up survey. And I will say that that was confusing for some participants. They replied and said, wait, I can't find this on mTurk. And I had to explain that, well, we've got a unique link that will track your compliance and then pay you a bonus. So participants received a link in their email that they could just click directly without having to log in to Mechanical Turk. But I mean, they still would have had to check the email address that they use for Mechanical Turk. If we would have set it up the other way, I'm not sure if that would have impacted compliance. We chose to do it this way just to make it a little simpler for us to manage. Although we had to schedule, 1,000 some emails to go out. And when I say we, Angela Wilson did the majority of those. But also it's one less step. They don't have to log into Mechanical Turk, accept the hit. They can just click the link and do the survey more quickly. I do think that we also tried to keep the surveys very short. And in retrospect, we kind of wish we would have added more, because now we've got a lot of exploratory questions that would have been really interesting to answer, but we tried to keep all the surveys under 50 items, just to make sure that we get as high compliance. I think we probably could have done about as well with a longer survey, maybe even a somewhat lower payment, but I'm happy with the compliance rates and data quality and so on.
Okay, well, if any other questions, if there are no other questions, just want to say thank you, Michael, and thank you, Brittany, for these really informative and fascinating talks. I really enjoyed them.